Welcome to this explainer. We usually think of musical revolutions as these grand, meticulously planned events, right? But today, we're looking at something completely different. We're diving into how a single, totally unscripted fumble, literally a moment of pure panic in a 1926 recording studio, rippled through a century of music and actually birthed the modern pop star.
So let me ask you, who was the very first pop star? When you hear that, your mind probably jumps right to the rock and roll era. Maybe Elvis, or the Beatles, or heck, maybe even a classic crooner like Frank Sinatra. But surprisingly, the first true pop star, the one whose influence shaped almost everything we listen to today, was actually a jazz musician. And he was playing by a completely different set of rules.
Yep, it's Louis Armstrong. Now, to really wrap our heads around his massive impact on the music you and I stream right now, we need to drop right into the middle of a high-stakes Chicago recording studio. The date is February 26, 1926. Armstrong is in there with his band, the Hot Five. And these guys were the absolute pinnacle of New Orleans-style collective improvisation.
Okay, so let's look at the actual accident that changed everything.
Armstrong and the Hot Five, which, by the way, featured absolute legends like pianist Lil Hardin Armstrong and trombonist Kid Ory, they were cutting a track called Heebie Jeebies. It was supposed to be just a catchy tune for a popular dance craze. But right in the middle of the take, pure panic sets in. According to Armstrong himself, and this was later backed up by his banjo player Johnny St. Cyr, the sheet music holding the lyrics literally just slipped off the stand and fell to the floor. Now, back in the 1920s, you were cutting a wax master. There was no hitting pause. If you stopped playing, you totally ruined the take. So the producers frantically signaling him through the glass to just keep going. And faced with absolutely no lyrics, Armstrong just started singing total nonsense syllables to fill the time. He later said, "These things just come to you in a flash."
Now, what's really fascinating is how this moment gets remembered. You'll often hear this story completely romanticized as the broken trumpet valve theory, where people assume his horn physically broke, which forced him to sing. And, okay, while it's true Armstrong did suffer from severe lip problems later on in 1933 that did force him to sing more, archival evidence shows that in 1926, it was literally just a dropped sheet of paper. This sudden failure of linguistic memory forced him to use his voice as an instrument. He had to abandon words entirely and just rely on pure musical timing.
Which brings up a really great question. When that paper dropped, why didn't he just freeze up?
Well, to understand his totally unbothered, quick thinking, we gotta look at his roots. Armstrong was born in 1901, and he grew up in a notoriously violent New Orleans neighborhood literally called the battlefield. His entire life was about improvising just to survive. From a really young age, he was dodging danger and hustling to support his mom and sister. He delivered coal for a Jewish family, the Karnafoskis, who actually encouraged his very first singing while he was riding on their carts. When you grow up constantly thinking on your feet just to stay alive, a dropped piece of paper in a studio, yeah, that's not going to break your stride.
That raw survival instinct was actually formalized into musical discipline a bit later. After getting arrested on New Year's Eve in 1912 just for firing a pistol in the air, he was sent to the Colored Waifs Home for Boys. And it was there that band director Peter Davis gave him structure and taught him how to play the cornet. It was this crazy twist of fate that literally replaced a weapon with a musical instrument, giving him a way out and laying the groundwork for his absolute genius.
So armed with that intense background of street-smart survival and musical discipline, let's jump back to that studio fumble in Chicago.
Look at the commercial reality of 1926 here, because the contrast is wild. You had mainstream, predominantly white acts, like Paul Whiteman, selling over 1 million copies of their hits. In stark contrast, Armstrong's Heebie Jeebies sold about 40,000 copies. But here's the catch. In the context of OK Records' Race Records demographic, which was specifically targeting the African-American migrant middle class in Chicago, 40,000 copies was a massive viral hit. I mean, it wasn't being pushed by the major trade magazines. It exploded purely through word of mouth because people were just blown away by this astonishing vocal improvisation.
But what exactly made this record so jaw-dropping? It wasn't just that he was making funny sounds.
Armstrong was actually pulling off a highly sophisticated translation of instrumental jazz grammar into vocal phonetics. He was consciously categorizing his sounds. For instance, he used front vowels, sounds like le and ifl, to mimic the high register, bright pings of his cornet, which instantly grabs your attention. Then, he used fricatives and plosives, like shudu, to create this percussive articulation that locked in that irresistible rhythmic swing.
The improvisation on Heebie-Jeebies was so incredibly precise that later that year, when the sheet music was actually published, the piano accompaniment mirrored the specific rhythm of those exact nonsense syllables.
Now, just to be historically totally accurate here, we do have to mention that Armstrong didn't invent wordless singing entirely out of thin air. Contemporaries of his, like Jelly Roll Morton, claimed an older comedian named Joe Sims actually invented it, and artists like Gene Green and Al Jolson were using vocal sounds even earlier. But Heebie-Jeebies was without a doubt the critical catalyst. Armstrong was the very first to use it with the complex, syncopated, improvisational genius of a lead jazz instrument. He literally put scat singing on the map forever.
In this phonetic brilliance, it completely shattered the existing paradigm of how music was played and consumed in America.
This is the crucial structural revolution he kicked off. Before 1926, jazz was really defined by collective polyphony. That basically means you had the cornet, the trombone, the clarinet, all weaving their notes together, sharing the sonic space equally. But Armstrong's Hot 5 recordings shifted that entire focus. He elevated the individual, improvising solo artist right to the forefront. He treated the human voice as a creative lead, right on par with a trumpet, fundamentally shifting music toward the soloist-driven art form that we all know today.
And what's profoundly beautiful is what he did with the actual subject matter. The term heebie-jeebies was a 1920 slang term for anxiety, the jitters, the shakes. Armstrong took a song that was literally about anxiety and, just using his voice, transformed it into this vehicle for joyous, rhythmic liberation. By abandoning the script of written lyrics, he found total freedom in pure sound.
And trust me, the music industry caught on to his genius fast. OK Records quickly realized his massive crossover potential and started releasing his tracks as both race records and mainstream pop records. By 1932, which is just a few years after that studio fumble, Louis Armstrong wasn't just a jazz musician anymore. He was the biggest selling recording artist in the entire music industry. He effectively became the very first black pop star.
And the wildest part? His influence didn't just stop in the 1930s. It built the music we listen to today.
Armstrong's invention triggered a viral ripple effect that spans a whole century. The very next year, in 1927, Bing Crosby was already out there mimicking cymbals using scat. That flowed right into the 1930s with Cab Calloway's high-energy scat humor, which directly inspired George Gershwin. Then it evolved into the crazy complex harmonies of the bebop era with absolute legends like Ella Fitzgerald. And incredibly, that same thread stretches right into the rhythmic flow of modern hip-hop MCs from 1979 straight through to today.
Literally every vocalist who came after him learned to treat the human voice as an instrument of infinite variation. Sarah Vaughan used specific fricative sounds to mimic the swish of drum brushes. Ella Fitzgerald used her voice to emulate the power of entire swing-era big bands. And today, a lot of hip-hop artists explicitly talk about creating a scat skeleton first, meaning they improvise nonsense syllables to lock down a complex rhythm and flow before they ever even think about writing a single word of their lyrics.
The thing is, Armstrong wasn't oblivious to his impact at all. Sometimes history tries to paint him merely as this always smiling entertainer, but he was a deeply aware, highly street-smart architect of American culture. He actually curated 700 hours of private tape recordings documenting his thoughts, his anger at segregation, and his deep musical philosophy. He knew exactly what he was doing. He was playing the long game, and he famously said, "They're going to write about me in the history book someday." And you know what? He was absolutely right.
Which leaves us with this final thought. The next time you are grooving to your favorite pop song, R&B track, or hip-hop verse, I want you to ask yourself, would that rhythmic vocal flow even exist if a single piece of sheet music hadn't slipped off a stand in a Chicago studio nearly 100 years ago? It just goes to show that sometimes the greatest leaps in human creativity don't come from perfectly following the script, but from beautifully navigating the fumbles. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and keep your ears open to the history hidden in the music you love.